Now on BBC Two Scotland, the temperature's falling. The Benny tragedy of 1951 changed the way mountain rescue teams prepare for storms. Just one of the stories in tonight's Weather Permitting.
It can be incredibly beautiful. And the cold is something we know well.
Tell me about cold. I know about cold. It's a physical situation with cold.
We are a determined nation, and we've learnt how to make the most of bracing days.
People have to wrap up warmly, scarves, hats, and even the thermals.
So we indulge in pashminas, berries, beanies, and boy can we look cute. We are a practical people, and we won't let cold weather hold us back.
You'll need to scrape your windscreen this morning. Many parts of the central belt are badly affected by ice and frost. Many side roads are like an ice rink. The gritters are out, but extra caution required.
But when temperatures drop, we can never get complacent.
The Scottish winter can kill people. It does on a regular basis.
So prepare yourself for the lowdown on cold.
Well, in the summer it's cold. It's fresh cold, it's breezy, but it's cold. In the autumn we get sharp cold. It's getting colder, it's becoming cold.
Cold, it gets you, doesn't it? Right in your bones, and you're all crunched up.
And then come the winter and it's cold. It's very cold. It's mere cold. It's extremely cold.
Oh, I think we're very hardy as a race in Scotland.
And then in the spring we get slightly less cold. In fact, there's just a wee bit of a springtime nip in the air, but it's not as cold. So basically the word we're looking for here is just cold.
I think people in North East are quite inhibited, not quite so easy and outgoing. You know, life is a little bit maybe harder here, perhaps even repressed.
In a cold climate, you've got two choices. Either to soldier on your own or to cuddle up to someone.
Look at bus stops, they're all standing there, all in their own little area. They've managed to heat up that little area of air round them, so they're not going to share it with anyone. They just stand there.
The coldest temperature recorded in Scotland is minus 27 degrees Celsius in Braemar in 1982. Icicles covered the buildings. Kids spent school days skiing, and most people managed to make the best of it.
And what do you think of living in Britain's coldest town?
It's great!
But it certainly didn't suit everyone.
Well, in Scotland, we're not actually as cold as we should be, given our northerly latitude. We should have a climate similar to Moscow. But because of the North Atlantic drift, which brings us warm ocean currents and conditions originating from the Gulf of Mexico, we're actually several degrees warmer than we should be.
The beauty of the Scottish mountains can be deceiving. On an average day, temperatures drop 1 degree Celsius with every 150 metres you climb. So the higher you go, the colder it gets. 52 years ago, Joss Gosling was an ordinary young man doing his bit in post-war Britain. He had no idea what Scotland's exposed mountains had in store for him.
In 1951, I arrived at RAF Kinloss to do my national service, and my trade was an engine mechanic.
Not one to be deterred by the cold Scottish climate, Joss joined the fledgling Kinloss Mountain Rescue Team.
When I joined the team, I felt that this was going to be a way of improving my ability in mountaineering.
The mountain rescue team in 1951 were probably quite inexperienced. They were thought of really as stretcher bearers.
We weren't supermen. We were just ordinary guys trying to do something we were extremely keen on. I mean, to put it crudely, it was just a suck-it-and-see exercise.
Joss's day job was to work on the Lancaster, a plane that had proved its worth in World War II. On the 13th of March 1951, Lancaster TX-264 took off from Kinloss on a routine navigational flight over Cape Wrath.
Very strong northeasterly winds were blowing the day that this aircraft took off. They were very, very cold winds as well. And the aircraft would have had to battle through 40-knot winds on the way back into RAF Kinloss. And at the height this aircraft would have been flying, certainly would have been flying in freezing conditions, so they had ice to contend with as well.
Well, we went off to bed as usual, not knowing there was any flying from RAF Kinloss.
The last report was that the aircraft was 60 miles north of Cape Wrath.
The bad weather had pushed the aircraft off course. In the early hours of March 14th, 1951, the Lancaster crashed near the summit of Ben A.
At 6:30 in the morning, the tannoy system in our hut reported to us that we were needed at the Mountain Rescue Centre as there was a call out for one of our aircraft that had not returned.
Joss and his mountain rescue team were about to face the harsh conditions of Ben A in search of the Lancaster. But the very mountains that challenge us are shaped by the cold itself. And 12,000 years ago, things were literally freezing.
There's scarcely any aspect of Scotland's landscape that has not been affected by snow and ice, and particularly by the great glaciers that passed over Scotland on numerous occasions in the last million years or so. Scotland, during an ice age, looks as though it's under a giant icy blancmange. The only signs of land during a glacial maximum would be a few mountain tops protruding through the ice in the Northwest Highlands. Everything else was completely covered.
The ice sheets eroded the highlands and deposited their debris on the lowlands.
I guess that the cold has had its greatest impact on the way the land looks up in the Scottish Highlands, particularly the Western Highlands, creating great wide U-shaped valleys. It's created steep corries and giving sharp serrated mountain peaks like those of the Cuillin of Skye or the mountains of Glencoe. If you understand a little bit about how it formed, how it evolved through times, it becomes even more wonderful.
The coldest Scottish winter on record was 1962-63, with an average temperature of 1.2 degrees Celsius. We all remember when we experienced cold for the first time.
The coldest day I remember as a child was when we decided that we'd go tatty picking up to Sam Sinclair's. My mum had tried to advise me not to go, but I'd wanted to go because the others were going. So off we set and started picking tatties. But suddenly it began to get very cold. Steadily a clegg of coldness pulled at my skin, sipped out the blood and replaced it by a whitening weakness. It seemed to come right through the ground, up through my boots, and soon I could hardly move. I ran home, but I could feel the rubber boots burning into my legs, and my legs were out like a scarecrow, and I was running down the hill, and I could feel the tears coming down and icing on my face. And I was so glad that day, so glad to get home and into the lodge and into the fireside.
So how does the human body cope in cold conditions? How do we react physically when temperatures drop?
The normal core body temperature is 37 degrees. That is the temperature in the centre of the body. At 34 degrees, shivering's at the maximum. They become confused, disorientated. By 31 degrees, consciousness is usually completely lost. By 28 degrees, the pupils become fixed and dilated. At 22 degrees, the heart is usually stopped. And 16 degrees is the lowest recorded temperature that people have recovered from accidental hypothermia.
Despite technology, the human body is still vulnerable to the cold, and Scottish industries consider the cold a potential threat to their staff and operations. The oil sector fly crews daily to offshore installations, and with temperatures in the North Sea dropping to 5 degrees Celsius, survival training is a high priority.
The guys flying offshore to offshore platforms, rigs and ships, you know, these can be up to 100, 150 miles offshore. One of the greatest hazards would be involved in the ditching into the North Sea itself, mainly obviously because of the coldness of it itself.
It's very serious. I mean, we're working in the North Sea, which is probably one of the most bleak seas in the world in terms of exposure. So anytime you're speaking about being in the water for a length of time, you're talking about needing to have some sort of protective equipment.
The guys got an opportunity to practice being involved in two different scenarios. One where it made an emergency landing on water under control and they then successfully stepped into a life raft. The second scenario, we hit the water and subsequently capsized. With that, they then escaped from the helicopter and we're looking at then in-water survival techniques to increase their survival time until rescue comes along.
Forces, sort of dangerous environment that you're working in and how you can survive and how you won't survive if you don't react properly.
Even with training and protective clothing, you'd be lucky to survive 1 hour in the North Sea. Without the right gear, you'd last only minutes. At Ben A, Joss's team had little experience or training, but were determined to find the Lancaster.
The priority was to locate the aircraft as quickly as we could, with the important factor of seeing if there was any hope of life from any of the aircrew.
Weather-wise, it wasn't a particularly good time for staging a rescue. It came at the end of an unusually snowy period through the winters, so the mountains in the north of Scotland did have a considerable amount of snow on them. There had been a lot of low cloud around, some quite strong winds, and also some periods of sleet and snow up at those levels.
It soon became clear that if any of the Lancaster crew had survived the crash, they'd have succumbed to hypothermia. But the search for the bodies of their 8 young colleagues continued in terrible conditions.
It's the most humane thing you can do. And you have to think of their families. You can't just leave people.
I mean, these guys were boyfriends, they were fathers, they were husbands. They had to get the bodies back. The aircraft is of less significance. It was expendable. But the aircrew, they are not expendable.
Sunday the 18th of March, we started at 800 hours walking from Bridge of Groody along the deer track into Glen Groody and across the shoulder of Roostach Moor into one of the wildest corries I'd ever seen. As we gained height, we got into very deep snow and it was drifting sometimes up to your waist. But we made it to the corrie where we found bits of the aircraft, and we felt bodies could possibly be buried in that snow.
For generations, people across Scotland have been working and living in cold conditions, learning from each other and adapting to the low temperatures.
Oh, I'm speaking about 35 years ago. We used to work without gloves or anything. And when we used to see net, the icicles used to start hanging for the ropes of the saltwater mine. And you was working without gloves picking up fish. Sometimes you have to work in the deck when it's cold, especially at the prawns in the winter time. Your aim in life at that point is to get that job done as quick as you can because you have a fine, cosy heater and you want to get your hands around that fine, cosy fire.
You had to have ways and means, you kept doing things, you kept looking out for plenty of firewood and things like that. Some travellers would use these things they called mugnies, and they would take this cloths and they would wipe them around their feet, you know, almost like galoshes, and that would keep the heat into their feet.
The first day I ever went to sea, this older chap, he had a pair of mitts. He took them, tied a bit of string on them, and threw them in the harbour. And I'm thinking, fit kind of nut are we going to seaweed? And then he put him on. And I'm thinking, fit the heck. But he learned, put on the weed mitts. By the time he started working, his hands were fine and warm.
I ken some traveller men that used to strip themselves every morning in the winter and use the cold ice and wash themselves down. And they said that kept them warm all day. Once they got over the initial shock of it, I was tried it as a bear and I nearly jaw off.
For some of us, there is simply no escape from the cold.
Homelessness in Scotland is a big problem. There are literally hundreds of people who sleep out every night. Physically, the cold can ruin your life. If you're out on a long-term basis, it accentuates any problems that you do have.
If you're not covered over properly, it can be very bad. Me and Chloe have been in a really bad way. You know, my feet and that was getting sore, and my hands and my face and my head and that.
If you're cold and have been cold for some hours, if you're wet, you then become aggressive, angry, upset, depressed. And until that is resolved, you cannot get help.
I fell asleep back in this wall. It was a really cold blizzard. And when I woke up, I was actually buried in snow. And, I dug my way out. And that was the coldest. It was really, really cold. I had ice all on my face.
The Scottish winter can kill people. It does on a regular basis. To know that that is approaching, to see the signs in the trees, means that you know that it's getting cold, it's getting wet, and you're going to feel miserable for the next 6 months.
A wind of just 10 miles per hour can bring a temperature of 0 degrees down to minus 20 Celsius. In the exposed Torridon region, Joss's team were ill-equipped, but strong-willed.
Mountaineering was still really in its infancy, so there'd been very little research into clothing for mountaineers and equipment.
Well, we were issued with this as our weather protection. This is the top jacket, and it was windproof, but certainly not waterproof. This is the boot that was used on the call-out, and the nails at the time were not there. They just had studs in them, and we had no crampons. We thought we were fine. We thought we were finely dressed, but when you reflect back on it, it was a joke, really.
Repeated attempts were made to reach the summit of Ben A, but the cold and storms kept pushing the team back. Though bodies were yet to be found, eventually the search had to be abandoned. It was just too dangerous. Clothing ourselves is the most obvious way of staving off the cold. Nowadays, we may not be that enamoured with Christmas jumpers or well-meaning cosy knits, but in the past, wool was the must-have clothing for farmers and fishers. Scotland needed a constant supply of jerseys and scarves, and Shetland's knitting industry flourished. Edmund Hillary climbed Everest in Shetland knitwear precisely because it kept him warm.
At one time, the Shetland knitwear was used to keep warm, but now they're putting it to different purposes, just to be fashionable. I knitted socks for my cousin, and I was 7 when he was born. That's the first time I knitted.
And we weren't allowed to sit hand idle.
No, there was always plenty of things to do.
When we were young, we had to be doing something.
Then we were selling things maybe when we were about 8 or 9 years old. They got us going early. Well, all the women did. It's a way of life. And it's kind of looked on, no, as a craft, but it's something they had to do. I remember an old lady that used to knit on the fingers wore gloves on her way to the peat hill. She didn't waste any time. She knitted on her way there and probably on the way home again.
Sanna Isbister has developed Shetland's knitting heritage and given it an innovative and seductive look.
I learned the basic hand knitting skills for my granny and for my mum. My family has been quite crafty, but they did it more for earning a living rather as you can anything else. I like doing things that I think that other folk hasn't done before, because that's what excites me about it. It's constantly trying to search for new ways to express myself in knitting.
The weather's there to be enjoyed. There's nothing nicer than to be out in a cold, fresh morning and you really feel full of the joys of life.
But sometimes it's easier simply to shut out the cold.
There's not a great deal we can do when the weather turns cold, except lock the doors, draw the curtains and put an extra log in the fire.
There's archaeological evidence of man using fire about 600,000 years ago. Clearly, it has enormous emotional and cultural influence on the way people react to fire. Nowadays, with the flick of a switch, we can turn on the central heating. We certainly forget what effort it took to heat your home.
We're burning peat, which is taken from the hills in Orkney, where we have a good supply of blanket peat. You have to be constantly replenishing a peat fire. It's something that becomes part of your life, you're constantly at it. It's cut in the springtime and brought home in the harvest time. It's a whole family process. Families used to go to the hill. It was a day out, picnic day, sometimes the kids regarded it. It's a way of life that has passed. I doubt that it will ever come back. It's very hard work.
As time moved on, the simple kitchen fire developed into prefabricated cast iron stoves, heating our homes, water, and much more besides.
I just grew up with an Aga. And then when I got married with an Aga again. Children, when they were small, if they come home from school, cold and wet, and there was always a scramble to see who would get to the cool oven first. If you're troubled with animals, maybe lambs, if they're out in the cold, stone cold, and have been left to die, put an old bit of sheet around them and pop in the oven for maybe 5 minutes. Don't shut the door. You do plan, you have to plan the way to cook with an Aga. It does need a little more. But I'm stopped planning because I've used them for 40 odd years, so I've stopped planning.
Nowadays, with double glazing, central heating and conservatories, keeping warm is simple. But the cold has kept Scots on our toes and inspired us through the ages. Our most famous bard played with images of hot and cold in one of the nation's best-loved poems.
Burns instinctively felt the weather in his poems. It's in poems like Tam O'Shanter as background, and indeed it's actually in the very fibres of the characters. They're aware of the cold, they're aware of the damp the whole time. Tam is the everyman Scot. In the pub, Tam enjoys warm handshakes from his cronies, warming liquor, and hot ladies who are all around him. And this is in contrast to the cold weather outside. The suitor told his queerest stories.
The landlord's laugh was ready chorus. The storm way out might rear and rustle. Tam didn't mind the storm a whistle.
The weather outside is Mother Nature in all her wrath, and Tam is loath to go home and to face his wife Kate, who represents another force of cold, feminine blasting.
The wind blew was to on its last. The rattling shores rose on the blast, the speedy gleams the darkness swallowed. Loud, deep, and lang the thunder bellowed. That night, a child might understand. The Deil had business on his hand.
Battling his way home, Tam comes across a very hot sight.
Tam passes the old kirk at Alloway, and there he sees the devil playing the pipes. He sees the hot-fleshed witches dancing around, and these witches represent, again, the forbidden and contrast with the coldness that he doesn't want to go home to.
When the witches catch sight of Tam, it's hot pursuit through the cold weather. Tam escapes by a hair's breadth.
The moral of Tam O'Shanter is that everyone in their life needs a bit of heat because the weather, because responsibility are so cold.
But from Tam's chilly nights to the present day, how are the cold winters of Scotland evolving?
I would certainly say that there was a greater frequency of severe cold weather in the 18th and 19th century, and we've experienced short snaps of that in the 20th century. The winters over the last few years have certainly been milder than those that we experienced back in the 1960s, say. And if we compare our recent winters with those of maybe the 1920s, then we're looking at something rather similar.
The worst place to be during a cold spell is inland. Mountainous areas lose heat rapidly and don't get the warming benefits of the sea, which keep coastal areas more mild. Villages like Aviemore and Braemar, which are surrounded by hills, often record the coldest winter temperatures. Up Ben A, Joss's team are hoping for a change in the weather.
When we returned a few days later, the weather had improved and we were able to get onto the ridge and then to where the aircrew and the fuselage were.
It took a lot of effort to get these bodies down, to actually get up there and get a body down from 3,000 feet is no mean feat.
I don't think there was any emotion then. I think this came at a later date. You just didn't have time to stop and think in that direction. It was a job you had to get on with. Saturday the 31st of March. The body was lowered and the rest of the party followed down a snow slope, 1,200 feet, to the track below and back to camp, where we arrived wet and dead tired, but happy to know we'd achieved something at last.
The team didn't stop returning to Ben A till the last body was recovered in August 1951, 5 months after the crash. What the RAF learnt about the cold from this tragedy affects us to this day.
The RAF learned a lot from the Lancaster crash. Teams were very poorly equipped prior to that, and they learned, in fact, that they had to give them proper protection, proper equipment, purely for safety and to make sure they could survive severe conditions.
The RAF Mountain Rescue Service changed, and it changed for the better, and it's developed to what it is today.
In 1985, the battered propeller of the Lancaster TX-264 was erected in the grounds of Kinloss to commemorate the crewmen who lost their lives and the brave individuals who battled through the cold winds and snow to bring their colleagues home.
I still feel proud that I was involved in it, and always will be proud of it.
Next week on Weather Permitting, it's getting foggy. From the mayhem it creates on the roads to the beauty it brings to our landscape. Join us to find out the truth about Scotch mist.